Okay. So, welcome everyone to the final I-HILT lecture for the academic year. And I think we definitely have got a really special guest for this week to finish off with a bit of a bang. So, we have today with us Professor Samuel Moyn, who is the Henry R. Luce Professor of Jurisprudence at Yale Law School and Professor of History at Yale University. He specializes in international law, human rights, the law of war, and legal thought, and 20th century European moral and political theory. Today's lecture is on the release of his latest book, Humane: How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. A brief introduction for this book is the rise of the American empire has coincided with appeals for a more humane war. But what if efforts to make war more ethical, to ban torture and limit civilian casualties have only shored up the military enterprise and made it sturdier? So that's just a brief introduction. Before I hand it over to Professor Moyn, just give you a little bit of a breakdown of the e-lecture itself. So for the next hour or so, Professor Moyn will be discussing the book. Following that, we'll have a Q&A. So we really do encourage you guys to participate and have any questions so we can have a really fruitful conversation after Professor Moyn has discussed the books. Now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Professor Moyn to discuss the book.
Hi, thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks to Deepak for the invitation. I'll try to, speak for far less than an hour just to give a sense of, the argument and then entertain your, objections and questions and whatnot. So I'll share my screen and hopefully it'll work to see these slides. So I, began thinking about writing this book in the first term of Barack Obama's presidency. So in the year 2009, because I was struck by his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech. It was such a different time, 2008-9, when Americans were incredibly optimistic about the future, and the world welcomed the election of Obama, with a lot of enthusiasm. The awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize within just 8 months of his ascent to power was just one sign of this. I remember vividly when he got the news along with the rest of the world in fall 2009, and he came down at the White House. He had a new dog. His daughters were still very young, and he said, that these children were helping him keep his global superstardom in perspective. He actually said he didn't deserve the prize. He hadn't done anything yet. Now, I think, as we'll see later, he actually had done something in that first year in office. But it's interesting that Obama tried to get out of going to Oslo, but he did in December, and he gave an extraordinary address. What interests me about that address is that he name-checked Henri Dunant, the founder of the modern humanitarian law project, a Swiss gentleman who called European states together to craft the first Geneva Convention in the 1860s. And it's interesting because Obama mentioned that there had been others who'd won the Peace Prize who were pacifists, not least another man whom he'd like to see in other situations as his predecessor, Martin Luther King Jr., who had won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. But in this speech, Obama said, with all due respect, King had never been at the head of the greatest armed superpower in world history. And Obama said he had to fight wars or leave the possibility of even eternal war open, given how much evil there is in the world. But then he made a promise meant to be worthy of the moment and the prize, which is when he cited Dunant. Even if America under Obama's leadership fought wars, they would be humane. They would take place in conformity with the Geneva Conventions and the spirit that Dunant had brought to modern warfare. Now, I could be wrong, but I don't think any president had ever mentioned Henri Dunant before. And we actually know that Obama did so because a lieutenant of his, who's written her memoir, Samantha Power, had drafted a memo for Obama about just war. And Dunant is in that memo, although it's still classified. And she came along with him to Oslo, and they worked on the speech together. And so it's quite interesting that she played a role in the speech. What interests me basically is how to think about the novelty of a president, a great power leader, promising to make war humane. I think a novelty in human affairs, and one that I think that Obama and many in his administration and in his audience took seriously in this period. And so what I wanted to do is put this moment in an adequate historical perspective. I'm not saying it was successful, but that's the ambition of the book. How had it become possible that some obscure Swiss gentleman would be not only win the first Nobel Peace Prize, win half of it in 1901, but be cited all those years later by an American president? Well, what I'll try to do is, in my time, is just look back at that moment when Dunant was hard at work and his successors were hard at work building what we now call, since the 1960s and 70s, international humanitarian law. And I'm gonna highlight not the Swiss, but this Russian novelist, Leo Tolstoy, who I think was a brilliant critic of the whole idea of making war humane. And then I'll close the lecture, after mainly exploring Tolstoy's anxieties about the humanization of war, by acknowledging that his worries were too early, but insisting that in the age of Obama, they came true, and we ought to take them seriously and draw some lessons. So Tolstoy, as as was a renowned novelist, and he actually, was most famous at the turn of the 20th century as a kind of Christian sage. And it's on that period that I focus in my own treatment of Tolstoy. But it's very interesting that there's a record, really, from his earliest writings of his concerns about making war humane. Not the first, but the most famous such instance is in War and Peace in the same 1860s, when the Geneva Convention was done. And, I can't prove it, and, it doesn't much matter if I'm wrong, but it might be, given this, we'd have to look at the drafts of the novel and the timing and so forth, but it might be that War and Peace discusses the humanization of war because the Geneva Convention and Dunant's project were in the news. At any rate, what matters is that Tolstoy's, hero, one of the two heroes of War and Peace, Prince Andrei, says the laws of war, humanity to the wounded, obviously the topic of the first Geneva Convention, is rubbish. Now, how could he say this? How could he reject what seems like an uplifting project? Well, André's argument is basically that leaving warfare brutal or cruel rather than, for example, helping wounded soldiers would actually make war less cruel. Paradoxically, leaving war cruel would make it less cruel. Why? The argument is something like this: if war were left unreformed, we would have less war. Statesmen would order less war. The public would support it unless it were absolutely necessary. Whereas cosmetic improvements of war make it more tolerable. Now, this was actually a really common argument, so far as I can tell, in the 19th century. Actually, it came more frequently in a slightly different form, that more brutal war will be shorter, not that it will break out less frequently, but that it will be shorter and end more quickly. Of course, you could believe both things. Either way, I want to note a couple of features of this argument, which I think are really interesting. First, it's on the same normative terrain as those who want to reform war, because the ethical criterion of judgment is the quantum of cruelty. And André is in a sense on the same terrain as Dunant in arguing that our goal is less cruelty in the world. And they just disagree about whether reducing cruelty in the fighting of warfare will lead to that result. And then the second feature, which I also think is very interesting, is that there's an empirical conjecture here. There's a blind guess that if there were no reform or less reform, there would be fewer wars. Or in the case of others like Karl von Clausewitz or Francis Lieber, who wrote the first national code for the laws of war, less frequent wars. And, this seems dubious to me as a blind guess or empirical conjecture. There's no reason I can see to believe that brutal war will be less frequent or last shorter amounts of time. And it's only fair to say so because the argument is empirical. It requires us to believe in the conjecture or reject it. I would rather, and I think Tolstoy did, cast Prince Andrei's argument in a slightly different way. And as I try to show in the first chapter of the book, I think Tolstoy did so as his career evolved, basically by arguing that there could be a risk in the noble hope of making war humane. Not that it's a bad thing, not that it has the effects that Prince Andrei claimed, but there are some effects that are perverse in making war more humane, or there could be. And if there's a risk, then we have to check how big it is. And if it's being incurred, we have to control or manage that risk. And basically, then the argument is that humanizing these sorts of evils, in this case, war, could facilitate or legitimate it, and make it easier to have, or make it harder to contain. And that's, I think, not controversial in and of itself. As we'll see, when we look back at the first reform campaign around cruelty, which was the campaign against chattel slavery, there was a genuine debate to have about the risks incurred. In our own time, in places like my country where the death penalty is allowed, advocates actively debate whether making the administration of the death penalty less brutal or less cruel could have a side effect of entrenching the death penalty itself. And, I don't think it's very easy to reject the claim, which is very basic, that there could be in warfare a possibility that humanized war is easier to start or last longer. What matters is whether it actually happens. What I want to suggest is that Tolstoy took this obvious possibility and gave it some nuance later in his career by looking at the way the risk could be incurred in real life, and in particular looking at through a couple of analogies at advocates who are trying to humanize war, like Duno and his successors, and beneficiaries, kind of, the public that is the audience or beneficiary for the humanization of war. So let me, follow Tolstoy's analogies for most of the talk, and then tell you in the end how I think they apply today. The analogies are between the humanization of war and the humanization of slavery before Tolstoy's time on the one hand, and the humanization of non-human animal slaughter in his time and since. And again, the point of this is to show how this abstract possibility that there could be humane entrenchment of evil could come to pass. So let's take the first analogy with slavery. Here, Tolstoy is looking back from the era of the US Civil War, or from the abolition of serfdom in the Russian Empire at roughly the same time. And he says, look, in the early days, there were people who either hated slavery but didn't think they could put together a political coalition to end it, or they thought slavery was fine as long as it wasn't brutally practiced. And they got together and made a deal with slave owners. And that was called amelioration law. And actually, it's only fair to note that for most of history, from the later 18th to the mid 19th century, most law concerning slavery was about the conditions under which humans could own other humans and limits on the treatment of their property. And you can understand why reformers would set out to make slavery less brutal. First, they don't think they can end it in the same way that a death penalty activist doesn't think it can be easily ended, at least in the near future. Or they think that slavery is not wrong, just brutal slavery is wrong. And so they engage in a certain form of activism. And it's interesting that they incurred this risk in doing so. They entrenched the practice of slavery. Actually, some historians, and I have one of the more famous ones on the slide, say, look, if you make slavery less brutal, the real enemy was more entrenched. There was less reason why it should be abolished. And at least some people accepted it more than they might otherwise have done. And so I want to get at this one dynamic in this analogy, which is what I'll just call briefly the advocate's compromise. The basic idea is that the reformer is helping the slaveholder and saying, I will fortify your property right in other people by making it seem less offensive to at least some people. And, Tolstoy invoked this analogy because he thought the same thing could happen with war. Duno and the I-HILT tradition is about compromising with militaries and states, saying you can have your wars. It's just they have to be fought under certain conditions. And in a sense, then fortifying the right of states to fight wars, which remains, however, much you think it's been constrained. Okay, the second humanization that Tolstoy considered is it works through an analogy with non-human animal slaughter. And basically, he's looking at a different group, not the activist or reformer, but the audience or beneficiary for violence. And actually, he introduces this analogy already in War and Peace, where Prince Andrei says that I-HIL is like the magnanimity of a lady who hates the violent slaughter of the animal, but is happy to eat it if she knows that it's been made less cruel. The slaughter has been made less cruel. And after his Christian conversion and so forth, Tolstoy kind of returns to this when he becomes the world's most famous, not just pacifist, but vegetarian. He writes a preface to an early animal ethics treatise and says, look, you know, there are people out there, and he genders this again, saying it's women in particular, who, you know, hate the idea that the violence for their sake or in their name is brutal, but are happy to have it continue once it's been made more humane. And the crucial idea here is bad faith, that she thinks she's a good person. She devours meat, which requires the death of animals, with full assurance that she's doing right, in Tolstoy's words. And that's because she's been presented with the fact that the violence is now less offensive. It takes place, but it's no longer outrageous in some way. And Tolstoy's basic point is that, well, this happens in war. This could happen. If you make it more humane, more people will say, oh, it's fine now. You know, if Barack Obama tells us that American war is no longer brutal, well, then we have no reason to criticize it. And Tolstoy thinks that's a terrible mistake for us to engage in bad faith of this kind. Now, of course, that presupposes, which Tolstoy did, that killing animals is wrong and that war is wrong. And of course, you might think that some wars are justified, and therefore we'd want humane war as a lesser evil. But if it ever is the case that some wars are not justified, well, then in those cases, I think Tolstoy's worries about the risks of humanization apply, because we would be told that some unjust war is fought humanely and take it seriously and think we're good people for benefiting from it or supporting it or having it fought in our names. Okay, so, you know, that's the 19th century. I don't want to leave it without acknowledging that there were other empirical conjectures that people made. One came from Dunant's successor, Gustave Moynier, as a, you know, Swiss do-gooder. And he actually, you know, deserves a lot more credit, I think, for, you know, the Red Cross and the laws of war, because he was in power for so many decades. And interestingly, at one point, he tells his funders in a speech, you know, I think that Tolstoy is wrong. Tolstoy's conjecture is ought to have been the opposite. If we make war more humane, it's like a first step towards peace, not enduring war. And his theory was that, to the extent that men on the opposite sides of a battlefield understand that they're fighting human beings and there are limitations on what they can do to their enemies, well, ultimately, how can they continue to kill them in the long run? They will, he says, one day accept that the very idea of killing is monstrous. The humanization, he uses the word civilisation, of war could only end in its abolition. Well, I rejected Andre's empirical conjecture or blind guess. This one seems also completely wrong, because it seems like what we now know is that this isn't true. We can have an era of more and more humane war that doesn't seem to involve lots of pacifism, just to the contrary. And so that's what I want to get at in conclusion. Our time, when I think that's at least sometimes the case. I don't want to, leave the 19th century behind without just mentioning my favorite research finding in doing this project, which was also from Moyn, when he says, look, maybe it could be that the humanization of war one day could make it so harmless that war would not be regarded as a terrible mischief. And he says, if that happened, I wouldn't hesitate to reject the 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 International Red Cross's laws of war project. I would fight the laws of war. It's kind of an amazing admission, and I'm not saying we're there yet, but it's kind of striking that Moyn wrote that there is this abstract possibility that humanizing war could, far from bringing peace, make it seem kind of no big deal or harmless um, in some ways, and then he would change his mind about his life work. Okay, well, in the book I have lots of other chapters beyond this 19th century chapter, basically to show delay and to show some big reasons why Tolstoy's anxieties were just way too early. Let me just mention those three arguments about why his anxieties were premature. First, and most important, I don't think the Geneva Convention of the 1860s was very representative. It clearly had a humanizing intent, but most of the laws of war, really through our time, but certainly through 1949, did not have such an intent. And that's especially true in the later 19th century in response to the Franco-Prussian War, since the spirit of the laws of war is really the spirit of military necessity and allowing militaries to be more brutal and not less, especially towards civilians. And if that's true, then Tolstoy's argument doesn't get off the ground. Second, I argue there was, for a very long time, a second track for justice or injustice. The laws of war were basically for wars amongst Christian whites across the Atlantic, not for global war. Now, obviously, that's true within European empires, since these are international treaties regulating international war, not what we now call non-international armed conflict. But even when they did apply, arguably, they were taken less seriously in fighting the non-Western, peoples and powers. And I try to show that in detail. Another way of putting this is to say that race and religion were predominant factors in the theory and practice of international law, still are, but very graphically for a very long time. So to that extent, the laws of war, even to the extent they were humane, were only for certain enemies, not for most enemies in global warfare. Finally, even against Christian white enemies in transatlantic war, it was very easy just to, bracket any humane constraint, notably in World War I. That's why I try to show that, peace movements actually were reinvigorated by World War I, and the prospect of making war less brutal seemed incredible. And so there was very little, public support for such a thing, just because it didn't seem like a, valuable activity. And so for all three reasons, there's no humanization of war really to speak of, in my view, until the later 20th century, even on paper, let alone in practice. And so if that's all true, there's no concern that Tolstoy's critiques kind of gain traction, because there's no real effort or progress in the humanization of war for a long time. That changes, I argue, in the later 20th century. And I assign tons of significance to the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions of 1977, because I do think those instruments do involve a quantum leap in humanization. Not only do you finally get the principle of distinction on paper, really clearly for the first time, but you get limits on the collateral injury and killing of civilians, which had allowed the central the marquee form of 20th century great power war, aerial bombardment, to take place without limits in prior decades. And that includes not just colonial air control, but World War II in all theaters, the Korean War in American history, and the Vietnam War in American history. And so, to me, the additional protocols are a really extraordinary quantum leap. And the reason why the humanization of the laws of war finally happens, as far as I can tell, traces mainly to decolonization, when after the 60s, you have about 4 times as many states as before. And the peoples who'd been the victims of brutal imperial war for centuries got a say about the content of the law. Now, of course, the main agenda of the new states was to strengthen an international peace culture in instruments like the Declaration on Friendly Relations. But it's true, there was a subsidiary goal of making a great power war, especially, less brutal. And I think that's the main reason, with the help from communists and West Europeans who are done with empire and able to take a moral stance. That would include the Dutch very prominently. If you look, at the average Dutchman at the time of Indonesian war versus in the 60s and 70s, you have a completely different moral sensibility. What interests me in this book, since I made it an American history most, is the American scene, where you have 2 new groups. First, new humanitarians to supplement the long-term discrete Red Cross project. There had been an anti-war movement in the Vietnam era, a kind of remarkable one, but it collapses, and instead you get the rise of outfits like Human Rights Watch, which commit to never saying anything about the justice or legality of starting or continuing wars, but commit to monitoring infractions of what is now called international humanitarian law. And basically, my thesis is that now we're in position to worry about what I call the advocate's compromise from Tolstoy's first analogy, because you have people who are bracketing whether wars happen, but monitoring how brutal they are. And of course, you have the US military, which I think self-humanizes in a way that no great power military ever has in world history. And lawyers are central to it, because they respond to events like the My Lai massacre by saying, we need, for ethics or optics, public relations, to adhere to the law, even though it now is more intrusive. And so you have a lot of military lawyers who begin to concern themselves with international humanitarian law. For me, a big turning point would be the first Gulf War after the end of the Cold War, when a lot of brutality is seen as permissible, including by West Europeans, since it's for them, for their sake in many ways, since they're under US protection. After the end of the Cold War, you have a war, the Gulf War, which is the first war that Human Rights Watch monitors for I-HL infractions, and the first war in which US military lawyers help pick targets to ensure that you know, the killing, the bombing is done in conformity with I-HL. And so to me, now we're right on the topic of Tolstoy's first analogy, where you have, in a way, an agreement between humanitarians and the military to work on the same problem. Now, they disagree about when it's solved. They disagree about when war is humane enough yet, in part because they interpret I-HL differently. But neither one is concerned with keeping wars from starting or keeping them from dragging on. They're concerned only with whether the rules of the conduct of hostilities are followed. Okay, so in conclusion, I think in spite of that prehistory, that all of this comes to a head in the era of the wars on terror. And I would just disaggregate two such wars within the period beginning in 2001. First, George W. Bush declared heavy footprint war on two countries, Afghanistan and Iraq. And by heavy footprint, I mean it involved lots of troops. Now, it's also true that it involved a brief attempt from approximately 2001 to approximately 2004 to lift some constraints of international law on how you fight, and most famously, detention rules, including the prohibition of torture. But then Bush began to rethink and reinvent the war on terror, and Barack Obama inherited and really extended that reinvention. The second form of the war on terror was more expansive geographically, many more countries involved. But it was also new in form. It was light and no footprint. It involved US special forces, and in escalating numbers. You see on the slide that by the end of Obama's presidency, those special forces, small teams of men who visit to kill, were setting foot in 70% of the countries in the world. And under Trump, that became 80%. And then, more archetypically or famously, there was no footprint war, armed drones, other kinds of, standoff missiles. And of course, Obama built a drone empire, including with, drone bases deep into sub-Saharan Africa. So it seems like there's some relation between the ending of the first form of the war on terror, what we can call troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, finally under Joe Biden, that is completed, but not leading to an end to the war on terror, rather to a geographical and temporal extension of the war on terror with different forms of killing and injury. What I want to focus on in my last minutes is that this transition also involved the humanization of the war on terror, a rhetorical humanization, and I think a real humanization. So there were, I think, two kind of really interesting periods to look at if you're interested in this. First is the period of delegitimating the war on terror after the revelation of the Abu Ghraib atrocities. And people mobilized around those, really still the biggest debate, certainly in the United States, around the war. And it targeted how it was being fought. And that's just really interesting. And Obama understood that brutal wars were being delegitimated by the form of activism and the form of public attention. And he did something, I think, brilliant, diabolically, if you like, but brilliant, which was in this crucial period in which he reinvented the war on terror in that first year of his presidency, when he very much did something. humanizing it, and putting the humanity of the war at the rhetorical center of his justifications or explanations of it. And I think changing policy so that the war changed in fact, so that it was more in conformity with I-HILT than before, and in a way took advantage of I-HILT to achieve the humane entrenchment of which Tolstoy warned. Let me just give you some sense of this rhetorically, and say a little bit about why I think there were real transformations too. In the Nobel address, he says, look, we don't torture anymore. We will abide by the Geneva Conventions, even when the other side, whoever that is, doesn't embrace I-HILT so fervently. And this, I think, is an incredible moment of legitimation. It's like the woman being told by her leader that, well, the violence in your name is humane now, so there's less to worry about morally. You are a good person. So here's where I think Tolstoy's account of the audiences or beneficiaries' bad faith is coming home, because Obama is talking to those who are satisfied, or at least more satisfied, but by a humanization of wars in their name or for their sake. At the National Defense University 4 years later, once the drones had become known, partly because the administration, made them known, Obama gave his other extraordinary speech on the war on terror. And it was especially fascinating because he was heckled. He was attacked by a peace advocate on the right, Medea Benjamin. Interestingly, she attacked him for saying the inhumanity of drones, saying that they weren't as humane and in their consequences as Obama claimed. Meanwhile, Obama went off script and kind of ruminated about how countries, think of the Roman Empire, that fight endless wars in their hinterlands, decline and suffer setbacks at home. And it seems like an incredibly prophetic moment. But of course, the whole point of the speech, especially once Benjamin had been ejected, was to say, don't worry, I am putting out guidance which will try to make sure that targeted killings, once an unholy practice in international law, are conducted humanely. Amazingly, as Nazma Mirzadeh pointed out, the guidance that Obama put out went beyond what the law of war requires by promising that if there's any likelihood of any civilian injury or death, the strikes won't take place. Now, what concerns me less is that was a lie, although it seems to have been a lie, is that it was made as a promise at all. Because the idea was that Obama thought he could gain some legitimation by saying, my wars aren't like Bush's. They're going to be humane in their conduct. Okay, well, my own view is that we should take Tolstoy seriously now, and I'll just conclude. I've done the 40 minutes and look forward to your questions. My own kind of ethical reflection is that Tolstoy was proved right, that these are anxieties to have about the humanization of war. He was too early, but now we know that the advocates' compromise in war is real, and the beneficiaries' bad faith is also real. And so we should, have our consciousness raised, and not that making war less brutal is a bad thing, but we should undertake that project with full consciousness that it's risky, that we should make sure that we're not incurring a risk of entrenching the wars we humanize. Or if there is a risk, to figure out how we control and manage it. And in my view, I think that means that we should pay a lot more attention than we have lately to the rules concerning the initiation of hostilities and not just their conduct. Now, in fairness, Vladimir Putin has put that concern back on the map in the last couple of months, but we don't want such rules to apply only to unpopular countries and leaders like Russia, since we've seen a lot of aggression in our time. And whether it's humane ought to be a secondary concern. We ought to have some way of controlling aggression itself. And so I'll end there and look forward to your comments and criticisms.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That was really fantastic, 40 or 50 minutes going through the book. So, if you've got questions, please get them going. Either raise your hand, or I'm more than happy for you to put them in the chat, and I can just read them out as you have written them in the chat. I'll start it off just to get the ball rolling a little bit by asking: Is perhaps the humanization of war the best that we can do? And I asked that in consideration of when I look back at the 1920s and the disarmament movement, and how, in all honesty, that was a real failure. But I mean, the idea was really amazing, and perhaps probably the best opportunity for that. This is the first time they had such a war on a large scale level, so there was this real push and drive to try to move towards more peaceful times and to negate the idea of war. So, on that basis, I feel like almost the humanization of war is probably the best result that we can come up with. Is that perhaps maybe like an accurate depiction?
No, I mean, in some cases, but not all. So, I mentioned, I try to cover in one of the chapters, interwar events, including the failure of disarmament. And it's not like we would just give up on disarmament as a result of that one set of events. But more generally, for I believe, for my argument to gain traction, would have to have like one or two wars not worth having. And if we had those we had such cases, we could say, well, were those wars rendered more credible or tolerable by the belief that they'd be less brutally fought through our best and noble efforts to make them humane. And if it's true that like there didn't have to be an Iraq war, there didn't have to be a Ukraine war, no credible justification. We can imagine alternative realities in which the war just didn't take place. Then we're on Tolstoy's terrain. We don't have to be a pacifist to be on it. Now, I agree with you that in situations where either we're just convinced a war is just, or we think it's unjust, but it's happening no matter what, then of course we accept the lesser evil, and it's a good thing to embrace the lesser evil over the worse evil. So I'm absolutely with you that if the choice is between brutal and humane war, we choose the latter every time. But sometimes it's between not having a war and war. And in that case, we wouldn't want to focus on humanizing war. We would want to focus on not having it. And so, then we're in a debate about, well, how many such cases are there? I think there are a lot. Like, I don't think my country has fought a just war in a really long time. And, Dutch war, I mean, well, I don't, I don't know how many of you are of Dutch nationality, and we could get into that, but most wars have been unjust and have set the world back. So then we can understand why at Nuremberg the control of force had an absolute priority over other matters. Why the United Nations Charter is all about the control of force and doesn't have a word to say about the conduct of hostilities. And so if we believe that there are alternatives in history, then it seems like we would want to reject the idea that all wars are inevitable, past and future.
Thank you for answering my question. I realized I came off as such a pessimist with that question, really, there. Okay, I think the first hand up was Michael Leach. So the floor is yours, and then I think Richard, and then Dahlia.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Sam, for the presentation. I haven't had the pleasure of reading your book yet, so this question is just coming off of your presentation. And my memory of reading War and Peace, because my suspicion, or I guess this is a counter argument, I suppose, taking the Tolstoyan, of what the Tolstoyan view, how to characterize the Tolstoyan view, I suppose. And so I'm wondering whether another position to take on Tolstoy is whether he would doubt whether you could control the conduct of war through rules or laws at all. Because if I remember the book correctly, he spends a lot of time trying to figure out why was it that the Napoleonic invasion of Russia happened. And he's very much arguing against the historians, like the grand figure historians, saying like, it wasn't Napoleon who decided that we're going to go to war. It was this whole confluence of things, and Napoleon just happened to be around and took credit for it. Which, and you could probably say the same thing with, Obama, and certainly that would kind of probably be a better explanation for Obama. Like, he inherited a war, and certainly came in with all intentions of maybe slowing it down or stopping it or closing Guantanamo Bay, and then, or maybe that was how he voiced it at a certain point, but he ended up, for structural reasons or political reasons or geopolitical reasons. I think the Tolstoyan argument would say like the tide of history just sort of turned him into a different type of war leader, that he had to he was in a position where he had to politically justify it in different types of ways as such. So I think from that, my suspicion then, or at least as I was thinking of a counter argument, would be like, if that is sort of a Tolstoyan explanation of why wars occur, or the degree of control that political leaders have in these sorts of moments, then wouldn't that then lead to some sort of conclusion that this idea of rules of conduct, which I suppose are to restrain leaders from engaging in war, restrain or control the actions of leaders from choosing to go to war, would probably be less effective than maybe lawyers might think they are?
Great. I mean, really an insightful question. So, I mean, obviously it's true that, I mean, no one should think that setting out rules is a panacea. Probably, lawyers don't think so. Maybe they're more tempted than others to think so, but it's not like they're that, slow-witted. So let's take them for whatever they're worth, which is probably something, rather than everything or nothing. Now, my main response could be about your reading of Tolstoy, but that's kind of a side issue. I don't think your reading's correct. I mean, I don't think his thesis in War and Peace is that history is entirely opaque and unpredictable. I think it's absolutely true that there's a view about Napoleon and about the best laid plans. At the same time, he lionizes General Kutuzov, and if you're in touch with the common people of your nation, and you might fare better and so forth. But it's really beside the point what Tolstoy thought. I mean, I don't think it's correct to say that the novel is about how we shouldn't have intentions, because history is surprising. that's clearly false. First of all, you can have an argument that you set out to do X and Y happens, but it really matters what X is in life, in our own lives and in collective life. But I'm saying let's not argue this through Tolstoy. Let's argue it through Obama. So you're absolutely right that Guantanamo Bay is an excellent example of how he really wanted to close it, and then history proved refractory, and like the Republicans and so forth. But I think that it's really important that he made moral choices and political choices in his first year. And he we'd have to look at, well, what are the ideological beliefs he has? What are what's the broader set of pressures in the bureaucracy that he faces, and then what are the decisions he made, because those matter. It doesn't just matter in life that decisions that are made are thwarted. It matters what decisions actually are made because they're followed through on. And I think it's only fair to say that I think, well, you tell me if you disagree, that the war on terror was made more humane between George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And that was a decision in principle that the president announced and supported, and that people below him and that the audiences and beneficiaries, or at least some set of them, took seriously. And if that's true, then we can focus not just on how like choices got betrayed by like the larger tides of history, but also on how choices were made that had effects.
Thank you. Richard, you were the next person that had a question.
Thanks, Deepak. Hi, Sam. So I really find this a really good breakdown of the book, which I have read, and I'm actually have assigned it in one of my, basically an I-HILT class at Tilburg. So, and my students responded to it in various ways. But I was super interested in this book because I came at it, I think, from Of War and Law, David Kennedy's engagement with this similarly. And I was interested because it's much more of a like an I-HILT focus than his ever was, I suppose, although he does touch on that. And I guess having kind of now those two in my head, I wonder about the fact that from this we get a sense of a shift, and with Vietnam we have a pivot, a moving away from talking about ending war or the causes of war, legality of war, and so on. And I wonder if part of the reason for this is also the blurring of the boundary between war and peace itself. So that has been eroded in much the same fashion as a sort of set of legal struggles, also by, well, the same really US lawyers around the same time. And we've had all sorts of discussions about preemptive self-defense. Right now, the war in Ukraine seems to play that out again. And so you have kind of resurgence of many people who are trying to be the purists, the Article 2.4 purists, and so on. And so I guess, although I completely agree and recognize that shift, I also wonder, whenever it comes to, okay, how do we place that alongside other dynamics, whether the same thing actually is happening or happened in relation to the legality of going to war itself. So in some ways, humanitarian intervention is just an example of the same type of shift happening in relation to jus ad bellum as what you seem to describe for jus in bellum. I'm not sure what you think about that, but it then also kind of leads me to, wonder, okay, where should the critical energy be going? Because, interestingly, at one point I kind of thought, oh, this is Harold Coe and then Mary Ellen O'Connell, and I find that a really interesting binary. And okay, we're seeing Coe on one side and Mary Ellen O'Connell on the other. And yet that still seemed unsatisfying to me, because there has been a discussion about legality and those types of things are going on. So I'm not sure what you made of that similar dynamic for jus ad bellum. But thanks for the talk.
Sure. No, thank you. Those are great, reflections. So I just mentioned that, the concerns of this are close to David's in his book. And in a footnote, I sort of say, look, I'm just trying to show that these are really Tolstoy's ideas before they were, the ideas in David Kennedy, or, the classic article about the Gulf War by Chris Joshnick and Roger Normand on the laws of war and the legitimization of violence. I try to say that, I'm trying to kind of give you an argument about a tradition of critique of which David is an illustrious member, but also I close the book wondering if we should really restrict the critique to the way that violence is perpetuated, because it seems like the central problem is that violence is humanized and even, slowly deleted from this age-old practice of war, and allows us to see, domination and hierarchy as much more central than violence. And maybe the Tolstoyan critique really is one that ought to be about domination rather than, as Kennedy said, about the way that law abets rather than, deters violence. But on your main question, I guess I want to hear more, because like the I-HILT, encounter between Harold and Mary Ellen was, it was not about humanitarian intervention. It was about whether aspects of the war on terror are in violation of the jus ad bellum, in spite of Harold's promise, like Obama, that they would be in conformity with the jus ad bellum. It's also true that Harold independently supports humanitarian intervention in some cases. And of course, you can tell a story where we have like an emerging rivalry about what it means to humanize the jus ad bellum. One view, the traditional view, is that it would allow us to have more humanitarian interventions. But now there's this emergent view with General Comment 36 and so forth, that, oh no, well, I mean, one question about the resort to force is how it implicates human rights law, and how aggression is a violation of human rights law. And therefore, there are these additional constraints potentially in the jus ad bellum than we thought, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, that's a really interesting debate. And I agree with you that, for the last few decades, we're living in a big era of the humanization of the law, not just of the laws of war, or as Ted Marone put it, the jus ad bellum. So, would it be the case that this argument applies more broadly to the humanization of the resort to force? Well, I mean, seemingly it might, in the sense that if you say that we have a newly permissive framework that allows humanitarian intervention, well, it could be that it sets, humanity back in practice. For various reasons. And actually, I would say empirically that does seem to be the case. Like all the humanitarian interventions, the Libyan intervention, make the world not better but worse. So that seems like I don't run that argument in this book, because as you say, it's narrowly focused, but absolutely it's a crucial argument to have. More generally, I think, and so many of us are interested in claims on the universal, which are so prominent in international law, and how they actually are false claims. And so, this is a book about such claims within one doctrinal area, but the critique of those claims has to be across the board. So I think I'm agreeing with everything that you said. Is that correct, or am I dodging the question somehow? Or
No, I mean, yeah, I think it's interesting to see those two things happen side by side. And
yes,
yeah, of course they have different struggles, and of course the fields are very differently arranged, especially because of, I mean, arguments could be made in I-HILT about this as well, but especially because the adherence, let's say, to a more purist or more expansionist idea of Article 2.4 and its exceptions is very flimsy when it comes to countries that actually are invaded. So, one day they may say, well, we need to be a strict interpretation, and the next day it's no. So it's interesting to see those two things side by side. But yeah, I thanks for your thoughts on that.
Thank you. So the next question was Dahlia. So the floor is yours. Go for your question.
Okay, thank you very much for this presentation, and two apologies. The first one is that I had a small technical problem, so I didn't hear the last 5 minutes of your presentation, but I was able to come back in. And then the second one is that I haven't read the book, but I came to the presentation of your previous book, I didn't read it at that time, but then I bought it and read it. So I'll do the same thing this summer and read it over the summer. So thank you for this. Look, it was really fascinating. And when you made the parallelism between wars and slavery, I thought about that. At the time, of course, when Tolstoy wrote, he didn't know what would happen with war and slavery. But now we know that slavery has been considered one of the most heinous crimes, while war has been humanized, as you say. That said, both are still present. And my field, business and human rights, we hear about modern slavery every day, although there have been, as I said, like it's really considered a heinous crime, not as war is not considered a crime under certain circumstances, right? So there is a very different way and narrative about that. Yet I feel that society somehow accepts both. And I'm wondering if this is really about us framing a phenomenon as humane or not humane, or is more about the fact that it doesn't matter what we do, but somebody will always get away with it because it's important for some people that are powerful. It's important to have wars. It is important to have slavery. It doesn't matter how we frame it. So that's my question. Thank you very much.
No, it's a fantastic, thought. And, I really like it because it pushes back at the general response to this line of argumentation, which is that, of course, it may have been obvious that you could abolish slavery, but it's not so obvious with war, especially since there are some just wars. No one would ever say there's just slavery anymore. But so I guess, I have a response to that, but your point is that actually slavery was never abolished. And therefore, those who might, like Tolstoy, say, well, looking back at the debate between abolitionism and harm reduction before the abolition of slavery, we should learn some lessons about war, is that, well, maybe we should learn the lesson that you can't abolish either. So I guess, one response would be, but it was legally prescribed. And as you say, I mean, I don't know. I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think slavery has been legally abolished everywhere, and in some places very recently, like Nepal, where I just was, like there were chattel slaves legally until a few decades ago. But that, so that's what we were always talking about. I mean, many practices endure, like murder. But no one would say, well, we shouldn't have a legal prohibition on murder because people still do it, genocide, etc. And so maybe we should set the bar not at abolition, but at legal abolition. Now, if it turned out that, like, were just relabeled and we got the same incidents of the practice, and then we would need to like figure out what to do. I think you might well argue, well, there's more slavery now than ever, based on some numerical computation. We don't have, some forms of it. So we're in a classic, like, debate about what Albert Hirschman called futility, that, and I'm not someone who thinks that reform is by definition futile. So then we have to say, well, if it turns out that, there's more of the thing we claim to have prohibited, then we have to figure out why we failed and try again. And when it comes to war, again, if you think that there have been wars that weren't worth it, then and therefore could be in the future, we have to consider what are the alternative outcomes for which we could struggle. And I just have a very modest position. It's not that history is just so overwhelming that we can't stop it. It's that we can tweak it. Maybe we can have one or two fewer wars. And it seems as if Tolstoy's arguments, I think, gain traction there, even if it turns out that slavery was never fully, eliminated, and even if it turns out that there's a disanalogy on other grounds between slavery and war. But no, your comments are fantastic, so thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Dahlia. Are there any more questions? Or any hands that want to be risen? Or anyone that wants to respond back to some of the questions that they had before? Okay, I will take the silence as we're coming to a nice and fluid end to the e-lecture. So first of all, I'd just like to thank Professor Samuel Moyn for his time and for the e-lecture. I'd just like to encourage everyone just to do a virtual clapping of the hands, just to show their appreciation. That's always quite a nice thing to do. And then I want to thank everyone for attending this event. It really is great to see so many people turn up. As I say, this e-lecture will be published online, so you can revisit it whenever. And also check out our other e-lectures. So we had Professor Anne Orford, Professor Ingo Venska, and Professor Sergio Della Valle join us this academic year. And we will be having a new slate of I-HILT e-lectures in the next academic year. So with that over and done with, thank you very much, and I will see you next time.